Hello, everyone.
Hey guys, on today's podcast, we are going to be talking about standards.
But before we get to that, we want to remind you that if you're enjoying this content, would you please hit the like button, and so that lets us know that you are in fact enjoying these videos. And of course, always hit the subscribe button if you haven't subscribed yet, because it makes me smile every time you do.
And if you want to support what we're doing, get bonus content, the best place to do that is over on Patreon. So a link to our Patreon is down below.
So this is something that I think all of us, or at least as head of households, have to work on, and that is holding a standard.
We talk a lot on this podcast about creating rules and standards, and that really is paramount to the running of your relationship and creating expectations within your relationship. I think that so many times couples will start with just these broad concepts of respect and obedience, and while those are fantastic places to start, it's not necessarily sustainable to maintain those broad categories. You need to create standards within those categories so that the expectations are known, but a standard is not a standard unless you hold it as a standard, right? And so you really have to look at, how am I holding the standards, and do these standards actually hold weight because I'm following through?
This kind of reminds me, as we've talked about in the podcast, is when you're putting your pillars together and then you're putting your rules together. Really, the third piece of this puzzle is holding the standards. Those only make sense and those only hold the weight by you following through and saying, okay, you need to constantly meet this standard or this expectation.
Because without accountability, without the follow through every single time, a standard is just kind of a good idea.
Right,
or
exactly.
A wish, something you wish for your relationship.
Or a hope, right?
Yeah. And so unless you actually hold that standard, follow through, it doesn't actually mean anything until you start to actually implement the standard into your relationship to see change and growth.
And this can be kind of confusing, where I say that I'm one of these people that has to really continue to work at this, and many head of households, you may agree with this, is that sometimes we think the standards are for extreme things, or standards are for when things really get out of hand. But if we really think about it, no, a standard is not something that is ever flowing or ever changing. A standard is a very set expectation that you put into place, and then it doesn't budge. It doesn't move based on feelings or based on your stamina for that day, or it doesn't go with the ebbs and flows of life. And that's really what you need to remember first off when you're thinking about, okay, what does it even mean to hold a standard?
I think there is a temptation that when you're setting up standards, you're thinking about the most ideal circumstances. And as it turns out, life doesn't always give us the most ideal circumstances. Hardly ever are we living in those perfect scenarios.
I wish.
And so there is a temptation to say, well, she didn't meet the standard that I have set for the way she interacts with me, or for the level of productivity that I expect, or the fulfilling responsibilities. She didn't meet the standard, but there's a really good reason. There is a temptation to look at the circumstances, to look at the reasonings, and I'm not saying that that should never be taken into consideration. There are times for those things to be considered. However, there are also times for those things to not be a part of the consideration, because you do have to make exceptions be exceptions.
Yes.
Words matter. Meaning behind words matter, and if you want your words to hold weight, you can't be always making exceptions, because then the concept of an exception becomes actually the norm. And so you really do want to look at this and say, how am I holding standards? How am I communicating to her what the priorities are by how I'm following through.
It's a good point that you made, that if you start making a bunch of exceptions, the exceptions become the standard. And so you want to make sure, absolutely, what Aria was just talking about, the exceptions are truly that. They're the exceptions. Now, is this difficult? Absolutely, of course it is, because our human nature is to want to make exceptions all the time, because it is difficult to hold a standard. It is difficult to hold to the rules. But head of households, I want to challenge you. One of the things that you need to ask yourself when considering, do I make an exception here or do I hold the standard, is how is this going to affect our dynamic? And is this going to help my taken in hand by showing leniency here? Or is it going to hurt her by showing leniency? And I will say, 9 times out of 10, if I'm being honest, it's actually going to hurt her ability to be a good taken in hand if I don't hold the standard and I make an exception.
So we're talking about like when to make exceptions, when to not make exceptions. I think that there are certain things that should never be excused away, that should never be made, there should never be an exception made for certain standards. So one of those things I think is how you speak to your head of household. I don't think that there's ever a good reason to speak harshly or to speak disrespectfully to your head of household.
This is a hard one, because this is definitely one of those areas where all of us make excuses, right? Well, I'm feeling this way, therefore I'm justified in how I'm speaking. And taking in hands, if we're being honest, right? There are times where you're saying, well, I just don't feel well today, or I'm having this happening in my life, and so this justifies the way that I'm talking to my head of household. But really, if we're being honest here, it's just like you were saying, no, it doesn't matter what's going on or how you feel. There is a standard here that is unmovable, that you should always speak to your head of household with respect, and regardless of what's going on in the situation, I think.
I also think that there really shouldn't be exceptions made around communication.
Right.
I was going to say obedience, but if Coda were to ask me to do something and there really is an exceptional reason why I'm not able to do that, that might be an exception made.
Absolutely.
However, I need to communicate that, and that's where the exception does not apply, is in my responsibility to communicate what I need.
That is a really, really good point, because communication is needed for everything, right? The good, the bad, the ugly, if you will. If you're not getting communication in those areas, especially like you were just saying, if there's some reason why when you're asked to do something, you're not able to do that for whatever reason, well, you got to communicate. If you don't, then it's not the act of disobedience necessarily for this particular task that you didn't do. It's the act of you're going to be punished or corrected because you didn't communicate about that thing.
Exactly, because if I don't communicate and I decide that I just can't do that for whatever reason, then I'm the one making the decision. I'm the one making the exception, and that is outside of my role. That is not coming under Coda's authority. My job really is to communicate so that he can then make the decision and make the exception for me, or he can figure out a workaround for whatever difficulty that I'm having in that situation.
You know, the things we just brought up right here, these are 2 key standards. I really think that if you're having some division in your relationship, or if you look at a lot of problems that you may have, even maybe potentially outside your relationship, but especially in your relationship, the standard of communication, as we were just saying, that standard right there, that solves 90% of issues. If you can hold that standard and hold it well, and really begin to develop good communication, you're going to solve 90% of your problems. Because I really think 90% of problems have to do with poor communication. If we base our ability to hold a standard, or taking in hands, if you base everything on whether or not you're going to be obedient or not to that standard on how you feel, that's never going to work. And so, head of households, you've got to hold the standard that it doesn't matter how you feel, you need to communicate with respect, and you need to do things in a respectful way, regardless of how you're feeling in that moment.
Well, because being disciplined, not the act of being disciplined, but being disciplined as a personality trait or as a concept.
As of what you do.
that is to put away your feelings.
That's right.
It is to do what is right, even outside of how you are feeling in that moment. It is to rise to the standard and to push through your feelings to do what needs to be done. And that goes for both the taken in hand and the head of household.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know what made me just think of it, and if this is going to sound a little absurd, but it absolutely is true in this way. How many times does the alarm go off in the morning and we feel still tired? Like, oh man, I feel like I could sleep a little more. That's probably true. But a disciplined person will say, it's still time to get up. It's time to begin the day. It's time to do things regardless of how I'm feeling. And it's funny, 9 times out of 10 when I do that and I get myself out of bed and I get going, in just a little bit, I don't actually feel tired anymore. I'm ready to go. I'm ready to start the day. But if I'd have given into that feeling, oh my gosh, that could be detrimental to my day.
And as a taken in hand, if I am feeling overwhelmed and frustrated, I can either allow that feeling to overtake me and affect my behavior and affect how I'm speaking to my head of household and the level of respect that I'm displaying, or I can be disciplined enough to choose my responses and reactions, ask for the support that I need in order to alleviate that overwhelm, and to be able to move through my day productively and in a way that honors my relationship and honors my head of household. As a head of household, you might not feel like following through.
Absolutely.
You might not feel like giving direction and leadership, but you push through those feelings.
Absolutely, because it is all talking about that act of being disciplined. That for both of you, that is really going to help the relationship thrive. And again, so I guess we could add maybe another standard in here as we're talking about the standard of discipline, and that is of being disciplined. For both of you, and you both hold that standard, and that's a standard. Another one that it doesn't happen with ebbs and flows. It is a standard that you've got to try and meet if your relationship is going to thrive.
Kind of the last key talking point that I want to make sure that we cover here is that a standard is not a standard unless it's a standard. And I know I said that earlier, but it bears repeating, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because if you do not hold the standards every single time, if you let exceptions be made on a regular basis, if you let leniency deter you from holding accountability for things, you are not creating and holding standards in your relationship. So what that means is, even if it's a one-off, even if it's something that your taken in hand hasn't done in months or years even, if she starts to struggle with that even the first time, if it's a standard, you have to hold it as a standard. You have to hold accountability. Again, even if it's a one-off, even if it's out of character, even if you can look at the situation and understand why that happened, if it's unacceptable, if it's a standard that you have set, you have to follow through with accountability so that mistakes become learning opportunities. You don't want mistakes to become detrimental to growth. You don't want mistakes to become hindrances to your progress. You want them to be learning opportunities, and they only become learning opportunities when you follow through with accountability and discipline.
You know, this is an area where, you know, I've kind of heard different words used when we talk about this with some of the head of households. Well, I really want to show leniency here. I really do maybe want to make an exception. I want to show grace. I want to show mercy. The interesting thing about all of these words, and this occurred to me the other day, and it just came up as we were just talking, is that those things are only meaningful when they're done rarely. Those things are only meaningful to your taken in hand when, again, they're the exception, not the rule. When you're holding a standard and you're holding it constantly the way that you should, when you do have that, when you do show those things, whatever word you want to insert there, when you do show that, then it does become meaningful, and it actually is beneficial to your relationship. As opposed to if it's constantly happening. Arya just said it. The word I would use is regressing. They're going to regress. They're actually not going to learn from that situation, and they're not going to progress. So you've got to make sure that 9 times out of 10, the standard is always being held. regardless of what's going on. And yes, there are so many distractions. There are so many feelings. There are so many things going on that are going to try to prevent you from holding the standard and keeping it where it is. But I implore you, as someone who has done exactly the opposite of what I'm telling you to do, I implore you, hold that, because long term you will see those benefits. And then again, when you do show leniency, it will be worth it, and it will actually help your taking in hand get better, not regress them.
If Coda did not hold me to the standard, I would very quickly realize that his words do not hold weight.
That's a good point.
That his words do not hold authority, that the rules and standards that he sets are optional, that I can do what I want because there is no follow through and accountability there. And I think one of the temptations is to kind of let all the little things go and only hold standards for like these really big things, like, ongoing disrespect or ongoing disobedience. And if Coda got to that point, number one, our relationship would not have the communication, the connection, and the closeness that it does, because he would be frustrated with me a lot of the time.
True.
And he has the power to alleviate his own frustration by holding me accountable and setting the standard and creating a system of accountability. He has that power, and he should use it in order to make our relationship thrive. But also, if he only held the standards for those big things, I would learn very quickly that I can basically do what I want and kind of be somewhat in my own authority to an extent. And that's not really productive to the goals that we have.
It's very easy without even realizing that taken in hand, and I've seen this in Aria, if I don't hold for those, what happens is they don't actually, this doesn't exactly happen in the conscious mind, but they start to lose respect. They start to lose trust. They start to lose all of these different things. And just like anything in life, the small things really eventually become big things. Most big things started out as a very, very small problem. And so one of the things that I've realized is that it's very, very rare that a problem is just big. It started from something very, very small that if you had taken care of it in the smaller moments, it would have never become something big. And that's what Arya is talking about here, is that holding that standard in those small moments will prevent the big problems from happening. So if you're already having huge issues with communication, well, you didn't stop those smaller issues with communication when you should have by holding the standard. If you're having issues with respect, or you're having these other issues in your relationship, and they become these big problems, well, go back to when they were little issues, and maybe what you need to do is hit that reset button and say, no, I've got to really start being where it's going to look like I'm very picky, that I'm picking on every little thing, but that's because I don't want them to become bigger problems.
And the more you address things when they are small, the more picky you become,
yes,
the less things you will find come up.
Yes, that's absolutely true. That's absolutely true, because I think you could speak to this. At first, it seems like, gosh, he's picking on every little thing. But then you start to think about that. You start to make changes. And then eventually, I'm not being as picky because I don't have to be, because you're remembering not to do those little things.
Exactly. At first, when you first start this, it might mean, several corrections a day.
Right.
Potentially. It might mean, very frequent discipline.
Yes.
However, after even just a few weeks of those things happening, you will start to see an evening out.
Yes, absolutely.
You will start to see that you're not having to discipline or correct very often because the standards are being met. They're being set. That she is taking your authority seriously and knows that you will back up your words with tangible consequences. And so she's coming under that authority and following the rules and meeting the standards. And so, again, just like you have to decide what will work for you. You have to decide how picky and meticulous you want to be. But we have found a lot of success in Coda being very meticulous with me, because then I can thrive and meet expectations, and our relationship grows and develops and becomes stronger for it.
but it does get better, and realize, oh, that didn't take very long at all. And in fact, if you hadn't have done that, you actually go, that actually becomes more of a headache than just doing this at first.
All right, guys, we are going to continue this conversation in our post show with a kind of a personal story about how we went through this recently and how we fixed it. So
absolutely,
if you want to hear our post show, it is open to YouTube members as well as Patreon members. Links to how to get connected in that is down below, and we will talk to you next time.
See you later.